Dad, your Parkinson's is ruining this family. Either move out, or we'll put you somewhere people like you belong, my son said at dinner after listening to his wife. My hands froze around the spoon. The pea soup trembled slightly as my fingers shook again. Parkinson's had stolen the steadiness from my hands 3 years ago, but until that moment, I never realized it had also stolen my place in my own family. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, leaned back in her chair with a tired sigh, like she was the victim in all this. You dropped coffee on the carpet again this morning, she said coldly. The kids are scared to even sit near you when you shake like that. My son, Daniel, didn't look at me. Not once. Instead, he stared down at his plate and nodded slowly, like a man signing paperwork he didn't want to read too carefully. The house just isn't safe anymore. Dad, he muttered, maybe it's better if you stay somewhere with medical staff. Somewhere with medical staff. A nursing home. The words settled over the dining room heavier than the silence. I looked around slowly. The same oak table I bought 32 years ago. The same chandelier my late wife Martha had picked out after Daniel got his first Little League trophy. The same family photos lining the wall behind them. Only now, none of it felt like mine anymore. I set my spoon down carefully. The tremor in my right hand made a faint clinking sound against the bowl. Vanessa flinched at the noise. That hurt more than the words. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. It's temporary, Daniel added quickly, finally looking at me, until we figure things out. But I knew that tone. It was the same tone people use when they put old furniture out on the curb and tell themselves it's for the best. I nodded once. No yelling, no begging. Parkinson's had already taken enough dignity from me. I wasn't about to hand them the rest. I understand, I said quietly. Vanessa looked relieved immediately. That was the part I'll never forget. Not the cruel words. Not even my son's silence. It was the relief on her face when she realized I wouldn't fight back. Dinner ended soon after that. Daniel disappeared upstairs while Vanessa began clearing plates with loud, irritated movements, like my existence alone exhausted her. I stood slowly from the chair. My legs were stiff tonight. The medication had started wearing off hours ago, but I'd skipped my afternoon dose to save money again. Neither of them noticed. Upstairs, my bedroom still smelled faintly like Martha's lavender lotion. She'd been gone 7 years. But sometimes, late at night, I still reached across the bed expecting to find her there. I sat on the mattress and stared at my shaking hands. These hands built Daniel's first bicycle. These hands worked 18-hour days to keep food on our table. These hands helped build the company Daniel now bragged about to investors and country club friends. And now those same hands disgusted him. A few minutes later, I heard tires outside. At first, I thought it was Daniel leaving. But then my phone rang. Dad? My daughter Emily said softly. I'm outside. I closed my eyes. Because somehow, before I even opened the front door, I already knew she had come to rescue me. Emily's apartment was small. Not cramped, not miserable, just small in the honest way working people's homes usually are. A second-floor unit above a hardware store on the east side of Columbus. One narrow hallway, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand in comfortably. A couch with a faded blanket folded neatly over the armrest. But when I stepped inside that night carrying my old brown suitcase, it felt warmer than the big house I had just left behind. Emily took my coat gently. You're freezing, Dad. I'm all right, I lied. She looked at me for a long moment but didn't argue. Emily had always been the quiet one in the family. Even as a little girl, she understood things people never said out loud. She made tea while I sat at the tiny kitchen table rubbing warmth back into my stiff fingers. The tremors were worse tonight. Stress always made them worse. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows while the old radiator hissed unevenly in the corner. Emily moved around the kitchen in wool socks and an oversized gray sweatshirt. Her hair tied back carelessly. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she finally asked the question carefully. What exactly happened tonight? I stared into my tea. The steam blurred my glasses slightly. Vanessa thinks I belong in a care facility now. Emily's jaw tightened instantly. And Daniel? I gave a tired shrug. He thinks listening to his wife keeps the peace. That made her look away. Because we both knew this hadn't started tonight. It started slowly after Martha died. Back then, Daniel still called every weekend. He still stopped by to watch football games with me. He still asked for my advice about business decisions at the company. Then Vanessa entered everything like perfume spreading through a room. Quiet at first. Hard to notice. But eventually impossible to ignore. Sunday dinners became once a month. Then holidays became too stressful. Then suddenly my Parkinson's became the explanation for everything. The spilled coffee. The slow walking. The shaking hands. The forgotten words. I became a problem people managed instead of a father they loved. Emily set down a plate of toast in front of me. You need to eat something. I'm not hungry. You barely ate at dinner. That was true. Vanessa hated watching me struggle with utensils. Every small movement seemed to irritate her. Sometimes she would grab things from my hands too quickly, pretending she was helping. The humiliation always stayed with me long after the meal ended. Emily sat across from me quietly. You know he's been changing things at the company, right? I looked up slowly. What things? She hesitated. Daniel moved your old office upstairs last month. He also removed your name from several internal documents. A strange heaviness settled in my chest. When? A few weeks ago. I stared at the table. 37 years. That company had taken 37 years of my life. I remembered sleeping in my truck during the early days because we couldn't afford hotels during out-of-state projects. I remembered Martha bringing homemade sandwiches to construction sites while Daniel ran around in a plastic hard hat pretending he owned the place. Back then, he used to say, "One day I'll run this company with you, Dad." Now he was slowly erasing me from it. Emily reached across the table carefully. There's something else. Her voice dropped lower. I overheard Vanessa talking to someone last week. She said once your shares are transferred, they can finally sell the company. My fingers stopped moving. For the first time all night, even the tremor paused. Transferred? Emily nodded slowly. She sounded very confident. Dad. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the city. I leaned back in the chair and suddenly understood something cold and painful. This was never about my illness. Parkinson's was just the excuse. The company was the real reason they wanted me gone. I barely slept that night. Parkinson's already made sleep difficult. My legs cramped constantly, and sometimes my hands twitched hard enough to wake me from dreams I could never fully remember. But this was different. This wasn't pain. It was realization. I lay awake on Emily's couch staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me while rainwater slid down the windows beside the fire escape. The company. Not me. That thought kept repeating in my mind until sunrise. By morning, Emily had already left for work at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade. She moved quietly before dawn because she thought I was asleep. But I heard everything. The soft footsteps. The coffee maker clicking on. The pause near the couch where she stood watching me for a second before leaving. Emily had always carried her love quietly. Daniel used to carry his loudly. When he was 8 years old, he followed me everywhere at the company warehouse. He wore tiny steel toe boots Martha bought him for Christmas and introduced himself to workers as the future boss. The men used to laugh. Now most of those same men probably answered directly to him. I sat up slowly, my joints stiff from the cold night air. My medicine bottle rattled softly in my hand. Only 3 pills left. I hated how expensive Parkinson's medication had become. Back when I still lived with Daniel, Vanessa constantly complained about pharmacy costs. These prescriptions are draining us, she said once loud enough for me to hear from the hallway. Draining us. As if the man who built their entire lifestyle was suddenly some unpaid bill they regretted inheriting. I forced myself up and shuffled toward the kitchen. Every movement took concentration now. Parkinson's turns ordinary things into negotiations with your own body. Buttoning a shirt, holding a cup, walking across a room without stumbling. People think the shaking is the hardest part. It isn't. The hardest part is watching people look embarrassed for you. Around noon, my phone finally rang. Daniel. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Dad. His voice sounded tense. Not guilty. Just tense. Emily told me what happened at dinner. I said quietly. A pause. Then a long exhale. Vanessa didn't mean it like that. I almost laughed. After 72 years on this earth, I'd learned that people always say exactly what they mean once they stop fearing consequences. She mentioned my shares too? I asked. Silence. That silence told me more than words ever could. Dad, nobody's trying to steal anything. Daniel said quickly. We're just trying to secure the future of the company. The company. There it was again. Not family. Not my health. Not concern. Business. I lowered myself carefully into the kitchen chair. When were you planning to tell me you removed my name from internal reports? Another silence. Longer this time. It was temporary, he muttered. The board gets nervous seeing instability. Instability. That word landed harder than I expected. I remembered teaching Daniel how to read blueprints when he was 15. I remembered co-signing his first business loan when no bank trusted him yet. I remembered staying overnight at the hospital when he broke his arm during college football. Instability. That was what I had become to him. A risk factor. Dad, Daniel continued carefully, you haven't been involved in operations for years now. That company exists because I gave it my years. I know that. Do you? My voice stayed calm, but something in the room changed after that. Because for the first time since Martha died, I stopped speaking to him like a father protecting his son. And started speaking like a man realizing he was being pushed out of his own life. Daniel cleared his throat. The board meeting is next Thursday. Board meeting. Interesting. Because nobody had informed me there even was one. After we hung up, I sat there very still. Then I opened my old leather briefcase beside the couch. Inside were faded contracts, shareholder records, and the original company documents I hadn't touched in years. My hands trembled badly as I opened the first folder. But not from Parkinson's this time. From something colder. For the first time in months, I wanted answers. The leather briefcase smelled like dust and old paper. I hadn't opened it since before Martha died. For years, it stayed in the back of our bedroom closet beside her winter coats and the photo albums neither of us ever organized properly. Life always seemed too busy back then. Now I had nothing but time. I sat at Emily's kitchen table for nearly 2 hours going through old documents while my hands shook against the yellowed pages. Stock certificates. Partnership agreements. Tax filings. The deeper I looked, the stranger things became. Daniel had lied to me. Not completely. Just carefully enough. He wanted me to believe I was already irrelevant to the company. A retired old man with fading memories and trembling hands. But according to the records in front of me, I still owned 38% of Keller Industrial Supply. 38%. My chest tightened. That was more than enough to block a sale vote. More than enough to stop major restructuring. And definitely enough to make Vanessa nervous. I leaned back slowly, remembering the early years again. The company started in a rented garage in Dayton with me and my best friend, Arthur Keller. We sold industrial machine parts from folding tables and loaded trucks ourselves because we couldn't afford workers yet. Some nights Martha handled invoices at the kitchen counter while holding baby Emily in one arm. Daniel used to sleep in cardboard boxes at the warehouse during summer breaks because he wanted to help Dad build an empire. Empire. Funny word. Families always think money makes them stronger. Most of the time, it just reveals who people really are. I found another folder near the bottom of the case. Board authorization records. I opened it carefully. Several signatures looked unfamiliar. Not fake exactly. But rushed. There were also changes to voting procedures I had never approved. My stomach turned colder with every page. Around 3 that afternoon, Emily came home early from school and found me still sitting there surrounded by paperwork. You haven't moved all day, she said gently. I rubbed my eyes. How long have you known Daniel was trying to push me out? Emily hesitated before answering. A while. That hurt more than I expected. You should have told me. I tried, she said softly, but every time I brought it up, you defended him. She wasn't wrong. I had spent years making excuses for Daniel. He's stressed. The company pressure is hard on him. Vanessa didn't mean it that way. That's what fathers do sometimes. We protect our sons long after they stop protecting us. Emily walked over quietly and placed grocery bags on the counter. Then she froze. What's that? I followed her gaze. A transfer request form. Partially completed. My name typed neatly across the top. Authorization for voluntary share reassignment. To Daniel Keller. My pulse slowed strangely. Not faster. Slower. Like my body suddenly became very calm. This was in the briefcase? Emily asked. I nodded once. There was no signature at the bottom. Not yet. But suddenly Vanessa's behavior made perfect sense. The pressure. The guilt. The constant reminders about my illness. They weren't preparing me for care. They were preparing me to surrender control. Emily sat down across from me slowly. Dad, did Daniel ask you to sign anything recently? I thought back carefully. 3 weeks ago. Vanessa brought papers into the living room while Daniel stood awkwardly near the fireplace pretending to check emails on his phone. Just insurance updates, she had said casually. My hands shook badly that day. She even held the pen for me at one point. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I opened another folder quickly. Thank God. The transfer had never been finalized. Maybe my shaking signature hadn't matched properly. Maybe someone at legal delayed it. Or maybe Martha was still protecting me somehow from wherever she was. Emily looked pale now. They were actually trying to take your shares. I stared down at the unsigned form for a very long time. Then I folded it neatly and placed it back into the briefcase. No, I said quietly. They thought they already had. The next morning, I called Arthur Keller. At 76 years old, Arthur still answered the phone himself. His voice sounded rougher than I remembered, but sharp underneath the age. Well, he said after hearing my name, either you finally decided to come back to work, or something's gone very wrong. For the first time in days, I almost smiled. Arthur had been there before the company existed, before the warehouse, before the trucks, before the money. He knew me before Parkinson's turned simple movements into daily battles. I need to ask you something, I said quietly. His tone changed immediately. What happened? An hour later, Emily drove me downtown to Arthur's office. Keller Industrial Supply had changed since my time there. The old brick building was gone, replaced by a polished glass headquarters with a marble lobby and giant digital screens showing quarterly profits. It barely felt familiar. Young employees in tailored suits hurried past without recognizing me. That hurt more than I expected. I used to know every worker's name. Back when the company was small enough that birthdays meant homemade cake in the break room instead of catered lunches from expensive restaurants. Emily helped steady my arm as we entered the elevator. My balance had been worse lately. Stress always accelerated the symptoms. By the time we reached Arthur's office on the top floor, my right leg had already started dragging slightly behind me. Arthur opened the door himself. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped forward and hugged me carefully. You look terrible, he muttered. So do you. That made him laugh once. A tired laugh. His office still looked old-fashioned compared to the rest of the building. Wood shelves, framed photographs, old company blueprints hanging beside newspaper articles from the early years. And there, near the window, was a picture of me and Martha at the company Christmas party from 1998. I looked healthier in that photo. Stronger. Arthur noticed me staring. She made this place feel human, he said softly. I nodded but couldn't answer. We sat down slowly. I handed him the transfer papers without saying anything. Arthur adjusted his glasses and read silently for several minutes. The deeper he got into the documents, the darker his expression became. Finally, he looked up. Did you sign any of this? No. Did Daniel ask you to? Not directly. Arthur leaned back heavily in his chair. That boy's getting manipulated. The strange thing was, Hearing someone criticize Daniel no longer made me defensive. Maybe because deep down, I already knew it was true. Arthur opened another folder from his desk drawer. These are current shareholder structures. He slid the papers toward me carefully. Daniel owned 22%. Vanessa owned none directly. But there was another name listed beside several recent investment accounts. Vanessa's brother. A man named Curtis Hale. I frowned. Who's that? Arthur's mouth tightened. A gambler. The room went very still. Arthur continued quietly. Daniel's been making reckless financial decisions for over a year now. Expanding too fast, borrowing aggressively. Curtis pushed several of those deals through private investors. I stared down at the paperwork. Numbers blurred slightly behind my shaking hands. How bad is it? Arthur hesitated too long. That was answer enough. They need your shares to stabilize control. He admitted finally. Without them, the board can block the sale. Sale. There it was again. Not growth. Not restructuring. A sale. They weren't trying to save the company. They were trying to cash out before everything collapsed. Arthur folded his hands together slowly. There's a board meeting Thursday morning. Daniel plans to announce the acquisition publicly. I looked out the office window at the city below. Rain clouds gathered over Columbus again, turning the glass buildings gray. For years, I thought Parkinson's was the thing slowly taking my life apart. But sitting there in Arthur's office, I realized something worse. My son had already started dismantling everything I built long before my hands ever began to shake. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the board meeting. Thursday morning. 3 days away. For the first time since my Parkinson's diagnosis, my hands weren't the thing keeping me awake. It was betrayal. Emily made spaghetti for dinner, but I barely touched it. My appetite had disappeared somewhere between Arthur's office and the drive home through the rain-covered streets of Columbus. You need your strength, Dad, Emily said quietly. I nodded like I agreed. But food felt meaningless when your own child was preparing to erase you from your life's work. After dinner, Emily sat beside me on the couch while I sorted through more company records. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of traffic outside and the occasional rattle in my chest when my breathing tightened. Parkinson's changes little things first. Your handwriting. Your balance. Your voice. Then eventually, people stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a condition. That was the part nobody warned me about. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. Vanessa. I stared at the screen until it almost stopped ringing. Then I answered. Her voice came soft and sweet immediately. Too sweet. Frank, I've been worried sick about you. Funny how concern always arrives once money gets nervous. I'm all right. We didn't mean for things to get out of hand the other night. She continued carefully. Daniel's just overwhelmed. I said nothing. Vanessa filled silence the way some people throw blankets over broken furniture. Fast, nervous, desperate to hide damage. You know how much pressure he's under at the company. There it was again. The company. Always the company. Not family. Not love. Not regret. Just business wearing human clothes. I spoke to Arthur today. I said quietly. Silence. A small silence. But real. When Vanessa spoke again, her voice had changed slightly. Harder now. I think Arthur enjoys creating drama. No, I replied. I think he enjoys honesty. Another pause. Then came the real reason for the call. We should really finalize those transfer papers soon, she said carefully, before the board meeting creates unnecessary confusion. I looked over at Emily sitting quietly at the kitchen table pretending not to listen. My daughter had dark circles under her eyes from grading papers late into the night. Her apartment was tiny, her salary modest. But she never once made me feel like a burden. Meanwhile, Daniel lived in a 6-bedroom house with heated bathroom floors, and still acted like my medication costs were destroying his future. I'm not signing anything, I said. Vanessa exhaled slowly. You don't understand the situation. No, I answered calmly, I finally do. The line went quiet. Then I heard something unexpected. Anger. Not sadness. Not guilt. Anger. Frank, The board already expects Daniel to take full control. She snapped softly. If you interfere now, people could lose jobs. Interesting. People always mention innocent workers when rich families start panicking about money. I built that company before your husband could tie his own shoes. I said quietly. Don't explain business to me. Her breathing sharpened slightly. Then suddenly she changed tactics. Daniel's trying to protect you. Protect me. From my own company. From my own shares. From my own life. Parkinson's had weakened my body. But at that moment, something inside me became very still and very clear. No, I said softly. He's protecting himself. I hung up before she could answer. Emily looked at me carefully from across the room. That's the first time I've heard you stand up to her. I stared down at my shaking hands. The tremor was bad tonight. Coffee rippled inside the mug beside me. For years, Vanessa saw those shaking hands and assumed weakness. But she forgot something important. These same hands once built everything her lifestyle depended on. And for the first time in a very long time, I was done apologizing for them. Thursday arrived cold and gray. I woke before sunrise to the sound of Emily moving quietly through the apartment getting ready for work. For a few seconds, I forgot what day it was. Then my body reminded me. Stress sat heavy in my chest like wet concrete. The board meeting started at 9. By 7:30, I was standing in Emily's bathroom trying to button my shirt while my fingers trembled violently against the fabric. Parkinson's always worsened under pressure. Simple things became humiliating. Button, slip, try again. Button, miss again. After the fourth attempt, Emily stepped beside me silently. Let me help. I almost refused. Pride is a strange thing for old men. Even after your body starts betraying you, part of you still wants to pretend you can carry everything alone. But I finally nodded. Emily buttoned my shirt carefully like Martha used to years ago before charity dinners or company events. That memory nearly broke me. You don't have to go if you're not feeling strong enough, Emily said softly. I looked at myself in the mirror. The man staring back barely resembled the person who built Keller Industrial Supply from a rented garage. My shoulders looked smaller now. My skin thinner. The tremor in my jaw had become noticeable recently too. But my eyes still looked the same. And for the first time in years, there was anger in them. No, I said quietly. I need them to see me. Downtown traffic moved slowly through the rain as Emily drove us toward company headquarters. Neither of us spoke much. I spent most of the ride staring out the window remembering old mornings with Martha. Back then, she used to kiss my cheek before board meetings and joke, "Try not to terrify the accountants today." I hadn't thought about that memory in years. Grief is strange. It waits quietly until life becomes unbearable, then suddenly returns all at once. When we arrived, the parking garage was already crowded with executive vehicles and black SUVs. Daniel's silver Mercedes sat near the entrance. For a moment, I simply stared at it. I remembered teaching him to drive in an empty church parking lot when he was 16. His hands shook worse than mine do now. Funny how life circles back around. Emily helped me out of the car carefully. The cold air stiffened my muscles immediately. By the time we reached the elevator, my right foot had already started dragging slightly again. People noticed. That was the hardest part about Parkinson's. Not the pain. The watching. The polite pity in strangers' eyes. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, conversations stopped almost instantly. Several employees froze when they saw me. A few looked genuinely shocked. One younger manager whispered something under his breath to another man beside him. I caught only 3 words. He came back. Back. Like I'd been gone permanently already. Arthur met us near the conference room entrance. His expression tightened slightly when he saw how slowly I was walking. You all right? I'm still breathing. That'll have to do. Inside the boardroom, polished windows overlooked the rainy Columbus skyline. Long black conference tables stretched beneath expensive lighting fixtures Daniel had installed after becoming CEO. Everything looked sleek now. Modern. Cold. And seated at the far end of the room was my son. Daniel looked up from his paperwork the moment I entered. The color drained from his face immediately. Beside him, Vanessa went perfectly still. Not surprised. Panicked. That told me everything. For months, maybe longer, they had been planning this meeting assuming I'd stay quiet. Assuming Parkinson's had made me weak. Assuming getting thrown out of my own home would make me disappear politely. Daniel stood too quickly. Dad, what are you doing here? The room became silent. I adjusted my grip on the cane beside me carefully. Then I answered in the calmest voice I had left. I came to hear what you were planning to sell before deciding whether it still belongs to you. Nobody spoke for several seconds after that. Rain tapped softly against the giant windows behind the boardroom table while Daniel stood frozen beside his chair. Vanessa recovered first. People like her usually do. She forced a tight smile and stood slowly, smoothing the sleeves of her cream-colored blazer like this was all some awkward misunderstanding. Frank, she said carefully, this really isn't the best environment for you right now. There it was again. That fake concern. That soft voice people use when they think old age automatically means helplessness. I ignored her completely and looked around the room instead. Most of the board members avoided eye contact. Not because they felt sorry for me. Because they already knew. Arthur had been right. This sale had been moving quietly behind my back for months. Daniel cleared his throat nervously. Dad, maybe we should talk privately. No, I answered calmly. You seem very comfortable making decisions publicly these days. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Daniel looked exhausted suddenly, dark circles under his eyes, jaw tight, tie slightly crooked. For a brief moment, I saw the little boy who used to fall asleep in the backseat while Martha and I drove home from late-night supply deliveries. Then Vanessa touched his arm gently. And the moment disappeared. The board chairman, Richard Mercer, finally spoke. Frank, we weren't expecting you this morning. I noticed. My cane clicked softly against the marble floor as I moved toward the table. Every step required concentration now. Parkinson stiffened my right side badly when I was under stress. But I kept walking. Slowly. Carefully. Without asking anyone for help. I stopped beside the empty chair near Arthur. The chair they used to reserve for me before Daniel remodeled the executive floor and quietly erased my office from the building. Funny thing about getting older. People start removing you in pieces long before they remove you completely. Richard adjusted his glasses nervously. We were about to begin acquisition discussions. Acquisition, I repeated quietly. Such a clean word for betrayal. Daniel finally sat down again. But he wouldn't look at me. Instead, he shuffled papers around pointlessly while Vanessa spoke for him. The market is changing rapidly. She explained smoothly. This partnership would position the company for future growth. Partnership. Another pretty word. Arthur leaned back beside me with his arms crossed. Tell him the real number, he said flatly. The room tightened instantly. Daniel's face darkened. Arthur. How much debt? Arthur interrupted. Silence. Nobody moved. Then Richard cleared his throat carefully. Current leveraged exposure sits around 43 million. Even knowing things were bad, hearing the number out loud still hit me hard. $43 million. I stared at my son. Daniel still wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, Vanessa answered again. We expanded during difficult economic conditions. No, Arthur replied coldly. You gambled during difficult conditions. Vanessa's expression cracked slightly. Just for a second. Enough to show the panic underneath. And suddenly everything became clearer. The expensive vacations. The remodeled house. The luxury cars. The pressure to transfer my shares quickly. They weren't building success. They were drowning in debt while pretending to swim. Daniel finally looked at me then. Dad, I was trying to fix things before they got worse. I believed him. That was the tragic part. My son wasn't evil. He was weak. Weak enough to let greed speak louder than loyalty. Weak enough to throw his sick father out of the house because panic had replaced judgment. I folded my trembling hands together slowly on top of the cane. Then I asked the question nobody else in the room wanted answered. How much of this company have you already promised away without my approval? Vanessa inhaled sharply. Daniel closed his eyes. And suddenly, nobody in that room looked confident anymore. Daniel finally pushed a folder across the table toward me. His hand shook slightly when he did it. Funny. For years, I thought I was the only one at that table losing control of my hands. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were preliminary acquisition agreements from a private investment group based out of Chicago. Several pages already carried Daniel's signature. And near the bottom of one section was something that made my stomach turn cold. Projected ownership redistribution contingent upon full shareholder consolidation. They already expected my shares. Not hoped for them. Expected them. I looked up carefully. You told them you had control already. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. It was supposed to happen weeks ago. Vanessa stepped in immediately. Frank, this merger was necessary. No, I said quietly. It was convenient. Her expression hardened again. The polite mask was slipping now. Good. I was tired of masks. Richard cleared his throat uneasily. The investors are expecting an answer today. Arthur gave a dry laugh beside me. Then maybe they shouldn't have negotiated with people who didn't own enough to sell. Nobody smiled. Rain hammered harder against the windows now, turning the skyline outside gray and blurry. I looked around the boardroom slowly. Men in $1,000 suits. Polished shoes. Expensive watches. All sitting inside a company built by two men who once survived on gas station coffee and bologna sandwiches. Success changes the smell of a room. But not always the character of the people inside it. Daniel finally looked directly at me. For the first time all morning, he sounded less like a CEO and more like my son. Dad, if this deal collapses, everything falls apart. There it was. The truth. Not greed. Fear. Pure fear. How bad? I asked quietly. Daniel swallowed hard. We leveraged future inventory projections to secure expansion loans. Arthur muttered something under his breath. I kept my eyes on Daniel. How bad? This time his voice almost disappeared. If the board blocks the acquisition, we could lose the company within a year. The room went silent again. And suddenly I understood why they panicked when I refused the transfer papers. This was never just about money. They were drowning. And instead of asking for help, they decided to throw me overboard first. Vanessa leaned forward carefully. We were trying to protect the family. I stared at her for several seconds before answering. The night you threw me out of my own home, I said softly, was that before or after you decided to protect the family? She looked away first. Not me. Daniel's face collapsed slightly after hearing that. Guilt finally breaking through panic. But guilt arrives late in people who spend too long justifying themselves. Richard shifted nervously. So where do we go from here? I looked down at my trembling hands resting on the cane. The tremor was violent now. Stress, exhaustion, anger. Maybe all three. A younger version of me would have slammed the table. Yelled. Threatened lawsuits. But old age teaches you something strange. The quieter you become, the more carefully people listen. I reached slowly into my briefcase and removed the unsigned transfer documents. Then I placed them gently in the center of the table. Vanessa went pale immediately. Daniel stopped breathing for a second. Arthur just leaned back quietly like he'd been waiting for this moment all morning. You tried to trick a man with Parkinson's into signing away his company. I said calmly. Nobody interrupted me. You isolated me from my own family. You removed my office. You erased my name from internal reports. I looked directly at Daniel. And when that wasn't enough, you threw me out of your house. Daniel's eyes filled instantly. Dad. No, I interrupted softly. My voice barely rose above a whisper. But somehow the room felt smaller after I said it. For months, you treated my illness like proof I couldn't think clearly anymore. I folded the papers carefully. Then I looked directly at every person sitting at that table. My hands shake, I said quietly. But my signature still matters. Nobody moved after I said that. The rain outside had slowed to a soft gray drizzle now, But inside the boardroom, the silence felt heavier than any storm. Daniel stared at the transfer papers like they were something poisonous. Vanessa looked trapped. Good. For the first time since Martha died, I finally stopped feeling like the weakest person in the room. Richard adjusted his tie nervously. So, where does this leave the acquisition? I turned slowly toward him. It leaves it unfinished. Vanessa leaned forward immediately. Frank, if you block this deal now, the banks could call the loans early. Her voice had lost all softness now. No more fake concern. No more pretending this was about family. Just desperation. Arthur folded his arms beside me. Maybe they should have thought about that before trying to steal control from a sick old man. Daniel shut his eyes hard. Arthur, stop. No, Arthur replied coldly. Your father spent 40 years building this company while you spent 6 months trying to hand it away. Daniel looked like he wanted to disappear. And suddenly, I saw something painful very clearly. My son wasn't sleeping at night either. Fear had been eating him alive for months. Bad decisions usually start small. One risky loan. One delayed payment. One desperate attempt to fix things quietly before anyone notices. Then suddenly you're drowning so deep that betrayal starts feeling practical. I understood that. But understanding someone's fear doesn't erase what they did to you. I reached into my briefcase again and removed another folder. Arthur's eyebrows lifted slightly. He hadn't seen these yet. Neither had Daniel. I spoke with legal counsel yesterday, I said calmly. Vanessa's face tightened immediately. Inside the folder were emergency voting protections tied to my original ownership agreement from the early years of the company. Back when Arthur and I were too poor to trust banks, and too stubborn to trust investors. Richard scanned the documents quickly. Then his expression changed completely. Oh my God. Daniel frowned. What? Richard looked up slowly. Frank still holds executive override authority on any sale involving majority asset transfer. The room froze. Arthur suddenly barked out a laugh so loud it startled half the board. I forgot you two old idiots added that clause after the Cincinnati deal. I almost smiled. Almost. Back then, Arthur and I made a promise to each other. If either of us ever lost our minds chasing money, the other one would stop the company from being sold apart piece by piece. Funny how the protection we created against strangers ended up protecting the company from my own son. Daniel looked stunned. That clause was never removed? No, I answered quietly. Because unlike some people in this room, I actually read contracts before signing them. Vanessa's composure cracked completely then. This is insane, she snapped. You're going to destroy everyone over pride? I looked directly at her. No, I said softly. You already almost did that. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Because deep down, she knew it was true. Daniel finally pushed his chair back and stood slowly. His eyes were red now. Dad, I didn't know what else to do. There it was. Not arrogance. Not anger. Just a frightened middle-aged man buried under debt and bad choices. For one dangerous second, I almost pitied him enough to surrender. Then I remembered standing outside his house in the cold with my suitcase while my hands shook too badly to zip my coat properly. I remembered Vanessa looking relieved when I left. And I remembered Emily opening her tiny apartment door without hesitation. Family reveals itself most clearly the moment you become inconvenient. I stood carefully using my cane. Every muscle in my body ached now. Parkinson's exhaustion settles deep once adrenaline fades. But my voice stayed steady. The acquisition vote is suspended, I said calmly. Nobody argued. Not even Vanessa. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, they finally understood something important. I was not the confused old man they tried to erase. I was still the man whose name built the company sitting around them. The meeting ended without applause. No dramatic speeches, no slammed doors. Just silence. The kind of silence that settles over people when the truth finally finishes humiliating them. Board members left quietly one by one, avoiding eye contact as they gathered laptops and folders. A few nodded respectfully toward me on their way out. Funny. 3 hours earlier, Most of them looked at me like a confused old man who wandered into the wrong room. Now they looked at me carefully again. Like I mattered. Arthur stayed behind near the windows while Emily helped me button my coat. My hands were shaking badly now. The adrenaline had worn off completely. Parkinson's always collects its payment after stress. Daniel remained seated at the far end of the table long after everyone else left. Vanessa stood beside him with crossed arms and a tight expression, but even she looked exhausted now. Not angry anymore. Just cornered. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Emily, can you give us a minute?" My daughter looked at me first. Not him. That detail stayed with me. I nodded once. She squeezed my shoulder gently before leaving the room with Arthur. The door closed softly behind them. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Rainwater slid slowly down the giant windows overlooking Columbus while the city traffic moved far below us. Daniel looked older today. Older than he had last week. Fear ages people quickly. "I never wanted things to happen like this," he said quietly. I sat down again with effort. "Then why did they?" He rubbed his face tiredly. "At first, it was just expansion loans. Everyone said the market was changing and we needed to grow faster." Vanessa stared toward the windows without speaking. Daniel continued slowly. "Then Curtis introduced private investors. Bigger opportunities, bigger contracts, and bigger debt," I replied. He nodded weakly. The payments started stacking up faster than expected. I remembered something Martha used to say years ago whenever Daniel got himself into trouble as a kid. "He keeps digging because he's too embarrassed to admit he's already in a hole." That was exactly what this looked like now. Daniel swallowed hard. "I thought if we secured your shares, we could stabilize everything before you found out." Before I found out. Not before they fixed it. Not before they protected the family. Before I found out. That distinction mattered. I looked at Vanessa then. "Forcing me out of the house was your idea." She didn't answer immediately. Which was answer enough. Finally, she crossed her arms tighter. "You refused to listen whenever we mentioned retirement communities." Retirement communities. Such polite American language for abandonment. "You stopped seeing me as a person," I said quietly. Vanessa looked away first. Again. Daniel's eyes filled suddenly. "I know I failed you." Hearing that should have felt satisfying. It didn't. Because fathers spend their whole lives hoping their sons become stronger men than they were. Not weaker ones. I stared down at my trembling fingers resting against the cane. "When your mother was dying," I said softly, "she made me promise something." Daniel looked up slowly. She said, "Don't let money turn our family cold after I'm gone." The room became still again. For a second, Vanessa almost looked ashamed. Almost. "I tried, Daniel," I continued quietly, "even after the diagnosis, even after the shaking started. I kept defending you because I thought grief and stress were changing you temporarily." Daniel wiped his face quickly. "But I wasn't finished. The worst part isn't the company," I said. "It's that Emily opened her door for me immediately, while my own son made me feel unwelcome in the house I helped pay for." That finally broke him. Daniel lowered his head and started crying silently right there at the conference table. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a tired middle-aged man realizing too late how much of himself he traded away trying to look successful. I watched him for a long moment. Then I stood slowly with my cane. Parkinson's made the movement awkward and stiff. But my voice stayed calm. "We'll deal with the company," I said quietly. "But whether we fix this family depends on what kind of man you decide to be after today." 3 months later, I was sitting on Emily's apartment balcony watching the first snowfall over Columbus. Winter had arrived quietly that year. The city rooftops were dusted white. Traffic moved slower below, and somewhere down the street, Christmas music drifted faintly from a coffee shop speaker every time the door opened. My hands still shook. Some days worse than others. Parkinson's doesn't disappear because life becomes easier. The stiffness still lived in my legs every morning. Buttons still took too long. Coffee still spilled sometimes if I wasn't careful. But something inside me had changed. For the first time in years, I no longer felt ashamed of slowing down. Emily opened the balcony door carrying 2 mugs of tea. Your medication alarm went off 10 minutes ago, she said gently. I smiled slightly. You sound exactly like your mother. That's probably why you listen to me. She sat beside me under the old wool blanket Martha bought during a road trip through Vermont almost 20 years ago. Funny how ordinary objects survive longer than entire versions of our lives. Downstairs, children laughed while throwing snowballs near the sidewalk. I watched them quietly for a moment before glancing toward the framed newspaper sitting near the apartment window behind us. Keller Industrial Supply withdraws acquisition plans. The company survived. Barely. Arthur stepped back into temporary leadership while restructuring teams worked through the debt Daniel created. Several luxury assets were sold. Expansion projects were canceled. Investors disappeared the second easy money stopped flowing. Funny how quickly strangers vanish once profit disappears. Daniel stayed at the company. But not as CEO. Not anymore. That decision came from me. Not revenge. Responsibility. For now, he worked under supervision rebuilding the damage one piece at a time. Arthur called it, earning back his last name. Vanessa left 2 weeks after the board meeting. Apparently financial struggle looked less glamorous once the vacations and expensive dinners disappeared. I didn't ask many questions after that. Some endings explained themselves. Daniel visited occasionally now. The first few times were awkward. Quiet. Painfully polite. But last Sunday, he fixed the loose railing outside Emily's apartment without being asked. Afterward, he sat beside me drinking coffee while snow flurries drifted across the parking lot. No business talk. No excuses. Just silence. Honest silence. Sometimes healing begins there. Not with speeches. Not with tears. Just small acts repeated consistently over time. Before leaving that afternoon, he paused at the apartment door. Then he looked back at me carefully. I'm trying, Dad. I believed him. Not completely yet. But enough. That matters too. Emily rested her head lightly against my shoulder now while we watched the snow continue falling across the city. You okay? She asked softly. I looked down at my trembling hands wrapped around the warm mug. These hands were weaker now. Slower. Unsteady. But they still held things worth protecting. Family. Dignity. Truth. For a long time after my diagnosis, I thought Parkinson's would be the thing that destroyed my life. I was wrong. The real danger was believing that getting older meant becoming less valuable. That illness made me disposable. That needing help made me powerless. But life has a strange way of revealing people clearly once comfort disappears. One child opened his door only while I was useful. The other opened hers the moment I needed her most. And in the end, that difference told me everything I needed to know about love. Snow continued falling softly over Columbus as I leaned back in the chair listening to Emily hum quietly beside me. For the first time in years, I finally felt home again.